Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the You Are Not Broken podcast. So excited to have Max Lugavere on today, who is a health and science journalist, filmmaker, and best-selling author of the Genius trilogy of books. And you have a New York Times bestseller. And we connected because you did a post about hormones and the causation to dementia. And that's how I discovered you and your life's passion. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Yeah, that article that I guess went viral has somehow been able to thrust me into the metaverse, is how I've heard it referred
Welcome.
to. Yeah, by our mutual friend Dr. Gilbert Lenz, who's incredible. And yeah, so it's an honor to be here, and thanks for having me.
Totally. I was listening to an interview you did with Jordan Peterson, and I really resonated with. I was like, oh, what happened to him is what happened to me. Is like you did a 6+ year deep dive into dementia, health, the causations, the prevention, and then you can't sit with all this knowledge. You have to do something about it. You have to talk. And I feel like that's what I did with female sexual health and hormones, is like you deep dive and you come out on the other end and you're like, people need to know this information.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I didn't go through the traditional channels. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not an academic scientist, and medical literature was fairly foreign to me at the time in at which I undertook this process. But when my mom became sick at a young age, I mean, it was I've never experienced in my life a stronger call to action. I was compelled in a way that I simply couldn't ignore, and I dove in. I had been a journalist for 6 years prior. I worked for a TV network that was co-founded by Al Gore. It was a television network in the United States. It was a news and information channel. And I had always been passionate about fitness and nutrition. So I knew where to look for research. I knew what PubMed was. And, as a journalist, I knew how to identify the skill of being able to identify credible sources and weed out the ones that were less so. But Alzheimer's literature, dementia literature, it was all completely novel to me. But because my mom was sick and because I was so desperate for answers, it's a journey that began about 10 years ago, and it'll continue on for the rest of my life.
Yeah. I think our brain's ability to make stuff stick because of like an emotion and because of like a passion and a drive of like, I was just reading it was brain markers. Lisa Mosconi, Dr. Mosconi sent this to me, who I know you had in your documentary. She sent this article looking at biotracers in the brain and what happened if you took menopause hormone therapy versus if you didn't. And like, I've been in the menoverse. I know tons about hormones, and I'm reading this paper that I'm like, oh, you need a PhD in neuroscience for some of this stuff. It gets thick pretty fast when you start getting into like the tracers in the brain and the parts of the brain and, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, I think the blood biomarkers that we typically associate with risk for cognitive decline, I think those are great. Like, A1C, insulin, fasting glucose, homocysteine, lipids, and things like that, omega-3 index. These are all fantastic, but now they're starting to, I mean, this is the new frontier. They're starting to look at biomarkers that are specifically related to amyloid, for example, the AB42 to 40 ratio, for example, p-tau in serum. And none of this has been clinically validated, but they're really hot on the trail for these biomarkers that might indicate years, if not decades, before the onset of symptoms, who is most at risk. And I think that's kind of like the new frontier of Alzheimer's disease. Because right now, when you are diagnosed, as you know, you're catching it late in the game. I mean, Alzheimer's disease is essentially a disease of midlife with symptoms that appear in late life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very similar actually to pancreatic cancer, which my mom actually passed from. Most of the time when pancreatic cancer is caught, it's already too late because there is no routine screening for it. It's
Mm-hmm.
in a part of the GI tract that it's just, it's very easily able to metastasize. And I'm certainly not a cancer expert, but that is also analogous actually to Alzheimer's disease in the sense that by the time it's diagnosed, it's a disease process that's already decades progressed.
Hmm.
And so we need to find these biomarkers that we can identify earlier so that we can then intervene and actually move the needle on the condition. Because at this point, right now, by the time you're diagnosed, intervention is just not super great, as you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. The medications that are FDA approved certainly aren't moving the needle very much, and certainly no cure. I think one thing that stood out that you said is like this stuff is happening 20 years before you're getting a diagnosis, and people aren't thinking of that. And then I started thinking like, well, that's what heart disease does too, and probably not all cancers, but that's what breast cancer does too. Of like they're like you've probably had this for 8 years before you actually on Tuesday you get the diagnosis of breast cancer, right? But it's like what actually built it didn't happen with a light switch or overnight or because you partied one weekend or something like that. And I think it's just going to take a whole paradigm shift of how people think of disease, kind of like a light switch, like you have it or you don't have it. And what we're saying is like, no, your lifestyle over decades and decades and decades turns into kind of this when the diagnosis goes on the computer.
Yeah, I mean these are slow moving disease processes. And so I think that's like really actually quite empowering because it gives us the opportunity to intervene. It offers agency. We might eat a certain way or adopt a handful of new healthy habits that might change the course of our cognitive destiny. But it's really important to, there's a quote that I love to invoke. I think JFK said it, who was before my time, but in any case, the quote is great and it's relevant to what we're discussing. And it's that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. And I think so few people really grasp that. It's only when there is that health scare that people most often get that motivation, or when a loved one gets sick, as it did for me.
Yeah.
And so, because that was in fact the case for me, that's why it's emblazoned this desire to evangelize healthier lifestyle habits, because the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. And there's no better time than right now to start.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in thinking about what you're saying is like, you guys, you actually have tons of agency. There's actually tons we can do. A little bit every day adds up to a really healthy way of living. And it flies in the face of the gene theory of disease, which is what doctors are taught. And I think that people have really bought this of like, it's your family. Like, how many women do I hear? They're like, well, my aunt had breast cancer, so I'm probably gonna get breast. Like, it's this like giving up of agency because genes are rock solid. And it's like the science of epigenetics and how your environment affects the genes hasn't caught up with like the dogma of like nothing you can do, can't pick your dad. And like this really passive way of being like your body is not your destiny at all.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the Human Genome Project, I wrote about this in my first book, Genius Foods, was actually a letdown, despite being this incredible, exemplary illustration of human might and ingenuity. And it was actually, we undertook it with the intent of being able to cure all disease, essentially. If you can understand the genetics of a disease, and you can obviously, whether through gene editing software or what have
Yeah,
you, I
you just
mean,
cut it out.
you just cut it out.
Yeah.
But the reason why it was a letdown is because the vast majority of diseases that people are suffering from today are actually not genetic in origin. They're epigenetic, if you will. They're the result of genetic interaction with the environment in which those genes were tasked to thrive. And
Hmm.
often we're not thriving. We're suffering. And that is absolutely the case for the conditions that I've decided to focus on, like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, where the heritability is incredibly low.
Yeah.
For Alzheimer's disease, I mean, the vast majority, 97% of cases are what's referred to as late onset or sporadic Alzheimer's disease, which, is essentially the result of um, lifestyle exposures. And we don't yet have all the answers, but we have we've been able to identify a few really significant risk factors. And then Parkinson's disease as well. The heritability for Parkinson's disease is incredibly low.
Mhm.
1 to 2% of cases are attributed to genes. The vast majority are due, again, to some kind of exposure or set of exposures. And yet, I was actually speaking at an event called the Brain and Environment Symposium in DC a couple months ago, and I was shocked to learn that the vast majority of research funding actually goes into the genetics of Parkinson's disease when it's not a genetic condition. So I thought that was really shocking and unfortunate. But the
Yeah, I
empowering
think it's
news,
the power of this gene theory.
yeah,
Like the dogma of it's just a dirty gene, find it or to get a drug to turn it off.
exactly, yeah, and it's not really doing anybody any favors. I mean, I'm all for research, but we need to start talking about these exposures, whether it's exposure to the standard American food environment or the standard American lifestyle, which is by and large a sedentary one, exposure to environmental pollutants like certain herbicides, pesticides, industrial solvents, and things like that. I think we need to start talking about this more.
Yeah. Um, alcohol. It's crazy what alcohol does to the brain. And like alcohol doesn't even have to be labeled as like this is a toxin. Like it's not even labeled as thus.
It's a carcinogen. I mean, you know this. Like alcohol is there's really no safe level of alcohol consumption. I mean, certainly I think it's the body is resilient and there's a certain probably threshold of tolerance that one might develop. But yeah, it's not good for the brain. I mean,
With
it's a
the window of
neurotoxin.
opportunity being 18 to 24, probably. once you're
Yeah.
older than that, the brain's like, no, I'm not gonna repair as much. No,
Yeah.
it's crazy the lack of education on like
Hmm.
the toxin that's sold on every street corner.
That's exactly right. And it's sad, it's unfortunate. I mean, I imbibe now and then. I'm not but even if you take the definition of moderate drinking, it's heavy drinking,
Yeah, right.
right? The
I,
definition of moderate drinking is not moderate at all. I mean, moderate drinking is 1 serving a day for women, 1 to 2 servings a day for men. I mean, that's 7 servings a week on the conservative end. That's insane to me.
yeah, no, it's a
I don't
lot.
have that number of servings of alcohol in a year, I don't think. I mean, maybe like once a month I'll enjoy a glass
Mhm.
of wine, but no, it's a neurotoxin and it's everything in life has trade-offs. There are risks and benefits to literally everything. I mean, I'm risking my life when I get in my car, when I
Mhm.
fly across the country in an airplane. Like there are certain risks that are worth undertaking and that's something that we each have to decide for ourselves, but in general, uh, the idea that alcohol, is that we've so closely associated it with celebration, um, intimacy, our relationships. Yeah, it's really unfortunate because it is, as you said, I mean, it's so brilliantly put that it's a toxin available on every street corner.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, when I started looking into like the role of alcohol and cancers and dementia and realizing how I was trained as a physician, physicians are not taught to tell people to not drink. We were fed the moderation. It's always don't do drugs, don't smoke, and alcohol in moderation. That is the party line. And it's so crazy of like, why did I have to think the alcohol lobby. Like I don't otherwise know why, unless there's just a bunch of physicians who loved alcohol who are making these guidelines. But like you will not find in any medical thing, don't drink alcohol. It says alcohol in moderation. Always.
Well, you're right. A lot of those studies that did for many years lead the American public to believe that moderate drinking is actually good for you. A
Mhm.
lot of those studies were, first of all, flawed studies, or not necessarily flawed, but they were stretched beyond the ability of the studies to, to determine cause and effect. They were
Yeah.
observational studies,
Yeah.
and a lot of those studies were funded by the alcohol industry.
Yeah, I mean, the alcohol industry is currently fighting very hard for America to not clamp down on stating that alcohol is dangerous.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've been following that. But
No.
because Canada came out, the government of Canada came out about 2 years ago saying there's no safe level. And like for Canada to say that is a pretty big deal. They have a drinking culture, right? But maybe it's because they pay for their healthcare. I'm not sure why they came down on it. So they said there's no safe level and caution if you go above that. And America hasn't said that yet. But America, it sounds like America's, whoever the people who decide this are, is looking at it, and the big people against it they're like, you're going to hurt our economy. You're going to hurt Northern California's winery economy. It's all like an economic counteract to kind of saying how unsafe alcohol is.
Well, it's very similar to the food industry here and the influence that the food industry has on, for example, our dietary guidelines. The latest committee, because our these committees meet every 5 years and determine how Americans should eat, and most recently the committee determined that there wasn't enough evidence linking ultra processed foods to obesity.
I think I saw that. Did that make news? I feel like I saw that.
Yeah, it made, I don't know if it made news, to be honest. I know that it people were talking about it. It was a trending topic on X.
Okay.
But yeah, it's incredibly unfortunate. I mean, we have all the research that we need. I mean, there was a recent updated meta-analysis published that found that ultra processed food consumption was tied to 30 negative health outcomes. And these aren't just health outcomes for non-communicable diseases like heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia, but worse mental health. So we have these observational studies that are clearly, strongly linking ultra-processed food consumption to these negative health outcomes. But then we also actually have randomized controlled trials to prove cause and effect. I mean, the one of the seminal studies came out 3-4 years ago, led by Kevin Hall, who's a well-known obesity researcher funded by the NIH, found that when people are given only ultra-processed foods to consume, they tend to overconsume their calorie budget for the day by about 500 additional calories. So, I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of additional calories. And you eat 500 additional calories every single day over the span of a week. That's a pound of fat gain. So it's like, hello. And nonetheless, there's quote unquote not enough evidence to causally relate it to the obesity epidemic. It's just so crazy to me, But then you hear that in 2020, 95% of members on the committee had ties to the food industry, to the pharmaceutical industry. I believe it's about half of the committee members on this year's committee. So it's just, the system is rigged and it's unfortunate, but advocating such as you are with your podcast and, as I do with my podcast and my books, I think it's a really, significant way to fight back. So I just hope people are listening.
I mean, I think it ties in, your conversation with dementia and prevention ties in so perfectly with where basically the Gen Xers are right now, right? The elder millennials, because they're like, I'm seeing my parents' age, or I took care of my parents' age. So they see what 75 can look like. And they're like, it has to be different for me. And they are in the conversation, especially in the hormone conversation, right? Of like, what can I do to be the 80-year-old I want to be? And it's like, whether it's the hormones or the exercise or the diet or the relationships with alcohol. But I feel like the prevention discussion is happening more than it's ever happened now. And maybe that's because we're seeing the older generation age so poorly.
It is happening, but I always try to be mindful of the fact that what I perceive to be progress might just be my own echo chamber.
We're all in a bubble, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're speaking to people who are health conscious, who are interested in these topics. But if you zoom out and look at the population as a whole, I mean, public health statistics are getting worse and worse, By the year 2030, 1 in 2 of us are going to be not just overweight, but clinically obese. I think that's shocking. And I don't know. I try to be optimistic, but we're certainly not trending in the right direction.
Yeah, totally. I mean, was it a shock to you that the doctors, the medical doctors, they're not very prevention heavy? Like maybe, you found the Alzheimer's prevention guy, like the one dude, but like by and large, there's a million physicians. We're all trying to take care of people and people are getting sicker. So you have to be like, doctors, what's wrong? Right? If we're just getting sick, maybe we aren't dying, but we're certainly not healthy.
Yeah, I just don't know if medical doctors are incentivized to advocate for prevention. I just think there's no money in that.
Hmm.
And that's not to say that doctors are ill-intentioned,
Hmm.
but it's just that's not part of their business model.
Yeah.
And so it's unfortunate. Yeah. I mean, I literally have, I've been able to identify and actually collaborate with one of the primary researchers in the field, who's a neurologist who's also rigorously studying and pushing forward the science of dementia prevention. And I even actually got to collaborate with him on a chapter in a clinician's handbook on the clinical practice of dementia prevention. It was published by Springer in 2019. So I'm trying to do my best to teach lay people and physicians alike. Um, they just have to be, open-minded to it. Many physicians, there are so many fantastic physicians out there, but a lot are also very kind of mired in their own biases, their own sort of uh, I don't know, preconceptions about these conditions. I don't know how many are that open-minded, particularly within the field of neurology, to the idea of prevention.
Hmm.
Um, and I also don't know, to be honest, if this is something that, like, I don't know if we're putting too much pressure on physicians. I mean, by the time when you show up to a neurologist, usually, I mean, that's not a good day. Like,
Nobody wants to be there.
nobody
You're
wants to
not
be
going
there.
in to say, how can I prevent the shit you see every day?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
yeah.
So I mean, it's the primary care physicians, but even beyond that, it's the fact that we just need to make this more of a public zeitgeist conversation, and I think that's a pretty heavy lift for most physicians who are not necessarily the best communicators. So yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to do my part,
No,
but
I think it's an impossible ask. I mean, the way you have 10 minutes to see a patient these days, 15 if you're freaking lucky, right? And writing a prescription is way easier, reimburses more because there's more risk. It's not that doctors get, for people who are listening, it's not that doctors get paid more for doing a prescription. You get paid more based upon the level of risk that you're discussing. So you're discussing surgery versus you're discussing you should walk 20 minutes a day.
hmm.
Right. So it's a discussion of risk in how reimbursement gets calculated. So there's more risk in a prescription, but a prescription's a lot easier. And I talk to a lot of doctor friends. They're like, my patients aren't exercising. They can't eat right. They don't know how to cook. They don't have the money. They're blah blah blah. So to them, it's like they're kind of hitting their head against the wall, because at the end of the day, it is on the human to try to have healthy habits. The doctor can't go home and make sure you get 8 hours of sleep.
Yeah, I mean, it starts with you. It's got you've Wellness is what happens when you're negotiating with yourself to get off the couch and get your butt to the gym. Wellness is what happens when you're pushing your shopping cart around the perimeter of the supermarket and you're avoiding, despite every cell in your being, you know, urging you to go into those aisles where we know the ultra processed foods lie in wait to tempt you
Yeah.
to minimize your exposure to those foods, which are designed essentially to be overconsumed and to be hyper palatable. So
Yeah.
wellness is definitely an inside job, and it's definitely something that people need to um, recognize as something that really is within their control for the most part. Because by the time you show up to a physician, I mean, usually it's sick care that most people are looking for, which is fine. I mean, if I get sick, I'm going to a physician
Yep.
and I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let him, tell me what he thinks I have, so that I could then use that information to help myself, after, once I leave the clinic. But wellness is something definitely that I feel that I have the reins on in my life. And it's something I think about, essentially with every choice I make.
Yeah. When you started filming this documentary, because this is how many years old now, was the start of you
Yeah.
filming this
10
documentary?
years.
10 years, right?
Yeah. I've been
So
working on this
when
project
you
10 years.
started it, were you like, was your vision different? Were you like, I'm going to find the cure for my mom? Or like, how did you go in thinking this was going to go versus like how it ended up going on really diving deep into prevention and what you can do for lifestyle?
I think I was probably a little bit more um zealous, maybe overzealous going into it, wanting to, find that sort of silver bullet diet. And
Be
I
the
probably,
fixer.
probably at the beginning I kind of wanted it to be more of a nutrition documentary, And it definitely has a bit of that. But what I've realized, thanks to my unfortunate real world experience and exposure to the field, is that there really are no easy answers and there is no silver bullet. And, you know, the if you spend any time on social media engaging in what's sometimes referred to as the diet wars, the one positive thing to come from those, those debates, which seem never ending online, is that you realize that there are lots of potential diets that could work for people. That, people are highly adaptable. You look across the world and there's tremendous diversity in terms of the dietary patterns that are associated with longevity. It's not a plant-based diet necessarily. It's not an all animal source food diet necessarily. But the one thing that they all tend to have in common, the one thing is that they tend to be low in ultra processed foods. They tend to be low in added sugar, for example. They tend to be not as highly industrialized as our food here in the United States for so many of us. And so that's really kind of I would say the core dietary message that we want to kind of push forward in the documentary. Not that there's one silver bullet diet, because that wouldn't be accurate. That wouldn't be true to the science. Um and so yeah, kind of communicating that nuance in a film is hard, but I think we did a pretty good job. But that's one area where the film kind of has shifted over the past 10 years of working on it.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion about the whole diet wars, which is just like, it's obscene. The
Yeah.
people that, side note, I'm actually in a stand-up comedy class with like a bunch of angry comedic vegans, which is hilarious.
Wow.
It's super funny. I'm like, I tell the instructor, I'm like, I don't think they know that I'm not a vegan, but I hope they don't kick me out. This is funny stuff. But I mean, I think the whole argument is like, between vegan and meat eating and blah, blah. To me, I'm like, I think this is just a distraction created by like processed foods to keep us confused and stressed and unsure. Because if we're confused and unstressed or stressed about like what actually is good, we're just going to reach for what's cheap and easy.
100%. And it's like the vegan ethos. I mean, people adopt veganism for many different reasons. There's an ethical argument, and I think that's fine. I think if you choose to abstain from meat for whatever reason, I think by all means do it. But the problem is when they start making health claims and they start making claims such that their diet is the healthiest diet for humans, that everybody should be abstaining from animal source foods. That's where I'm like, okay, pump the brakes. This is hearsay. There's no evidence to support what it is that you're saying. And the evidence that we do have that you are using to support your statements is very weak. And, like literally the literal wrong kind of evidence that should be used to steer behavior, which should ultimately be randomized control trials and things like that, which we have precious few in the field of nutrition. And animal source foods are some of the most nutrient dense foods available to people. And I just think it's like really sad that in a food environment where 60% of the calories of your average American's diet comes from ultra processed foods, that anybody out there is still demonizing any whole food.
Right.
To me is just really sad and amoral, actually.
I feel like my whole life, I was born in the late 70s. My whole life has been a back and forth about the arguments of are eggs good or not? Like my whole life has had that argument of like, oh, the cholesterol and blah, blah. And I think, for the cholesterol thing, we've come full circle to the point where people are now questioning statins and being like, maybe we're not supposed to knock people's cholesterol down so low. And this whole like theory that food made the cholesterol go high versus lifestyle and processed foods and too much sugar is making your cholesterol go high. It's not the cholesterol, the cholesterol laden animal food. Do you want to dive into cholesterol and kind of the evolution of that?
Yeah, I mean it's a contentious topic because their cholesterol is an industry. We have to remember that as much as it is represents a handful of biomarkers, it's very much an industry, and it's, billions of dollars worth of statin drugs are sold every year. But it's not just the pharmaceutical industry that has a vested interest in perpetuating the notion that, for example, LDL cholesterol is bad. It's also the food industry, because the food industry sells these highly profitable, super high margin, refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils, which
Mhm.
also reduce LDL cholesterol compared to, for example, saturated fat, which is often the argument made to use.
That's all your heart health margarines. Is that
Yes,
right? Okay.
precisely.
That's in
Yeah.
air quotes for people who can't see
Yeah.
my air quote heart health margarines out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And
My
social media,
in-laws only will eat that after his heart attack, by the way.
it's crazy. Yeah. I mean, I grew up on that stuff. Those are the kinds of fats that my mom consumed for the majority of her life, because my mom was particularly heart health conscious. And yeah, but there's social media tends to surface very extreme viewpoints. And so we also live in a world where there are people who are on the so-called carnivore diet who, will make claims on social media like there's no upper threshold of LDL, and, we can essentially be walking around with our total cholesterol in the 500s and it's all good. And I would never say that, because I think that's an irresponsible claim as well. But
Mhm.
the way that I view LDL, for example, and ApoB, which is a more specific um, bucket into which LDL falls along with other lipoproteins, is that it should be used as a check engine light.
Mhm.
If your LDL is high, I mean, you might have even subclinical hypothyroidism, which you correct for that, and you might see your LDL levels normalize. It could be a higher LDL could be a response to infection. It could be due to being overweight. I mean, there's a lot of factors here that come into play, but so often in these sort of diet arguments, and there's also a big genetic component, as you know,
Mhm.
but oftentimes people will use LDL to point the finger at red meat. See, we shouldn't be eating red meat. And I'll concede that LDL is a newly high midlife LDL is a newly identified risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, identified in the 2024 Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention. But again, um, we can't just look at these biomarkers in isolation. I think we have to, and we also, when the leap gets made to, you know, our behaviors, our food choices, I think so often people will use that to point a finger at red meat. And it's like, if you cut out red meat from your diet, well, what's the risk of doing that? Yes, your LDL might come down a little bit, but you're foregoing a really high quality source of dietary protein. You're foregoing an unprocessed or a minimally processed food. In so doing, you're cutting out of your diet a really significant and important source of dietary choline, for example, which we know is really important to brain health. Creatine, which we know is supportive of brain health.
Mhm.
All of these other nutrients that we know are so important. And so we can't just myopically focus on this one single biomarker and use that to make these sweeping excisions with regards to our diets. It's just, I think, not smart.
Not smart. Is there a marker of inflammation that you think stands above the noise, as like, this says there's inflammation going on in your body and maybe it's a check engine light? Is there a favorite that kind of floats up?
I mean, as far as I know, it's really only CRP. I mean, you could get more granular and look at these, other cytokines like IL-6, NF-kappa B, like that. But I don't know how clinically validated those are, and
Mhm.
those might be more labile, as compared to CRP. Um, so yeah, I would say, I mean, as far as like a standard basic lab panel goes, CRP is pretty good.
Mhm. Yeah. When you started this and you were starting to, like, I am assuming changing your lifestyle, unless you were born brain prevention, like, from the get-go, but it's like, did you get pushback from family? Did you get pushback from friends? Or are they like, you've gone too far? Like, or was everybody super, like, loving and accepting and open? Like, what did you, because, for example, when people want to stop drinking, like, it's a big disruption to their friend unit, right? So, like, did you have to go through that on your hero's journey?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have gotten pushback. I mean, I've gotten pushback every step of the way, not exclusively from family, although I think, yeah, there was a period where my mom was always super gung ho, but my little brothers always, I think, you know, many times were scratching their heads wondering what the hell I was doing. But, uh, but no, I mean, generally people have been, it's a really noble aim to try to elucidate a path to better brain health. I mean,
Yeah.
what's more important than that? The pushback that I do get occasionally, I've been steeped in this topic for over a decade at this point, but I'll still get, people will say, "Oh, well, Max is not a medical doctor. Max is not a PhD in nutrition," which is fine. I never aim to misrepresent myself. I'm not, but I've been studying and quote unquote reporting on the research that I've been doing, and obviously I've created a really significant body of work at this point. So if people choose not to listen to me, that's totally fine. They can get their information elsewhere. But I do my best to stick to the scientific evidence while still remaining open-minded to the possibility that our evidence base can be pretty weak, particularly with regards to nutrition. Um, and I try to always, keep my biases in check and to update my knowledge base and to pivot when new data presents itself where I might have been, you know, for example, incorrect in the past about a given idea or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I think the problem with many quote unquote experts is that they tend to be mired in what they learned in school, and they might not necessarily have the real world experience that I have had with my mom. And maybe they have other what I call covert biases,
Hmm.
I see a lot of people, for example, that advocate for veganism as a diet who are who are what I refer to as covert activists. So maybe they are, very passionate about climate change, for example, but they're not as forthcoming with that
Hmm.
interest of theirs, and so that is sort of coloring how their dietary recommendations go. So I don't really have any of that. My number one priority is health and reducing suffering in the world through the lens of health, primarily nutrition.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, I think as long as I keep being really open and honest and transparent about my motivations, it's been pretty, I'm pretty easily able to swat off, the critics, so to speak.
Yeah, totally. I mean, somebody had said that you bring reason and common sense back to the conversation around diet, and it's like nothing is hotter. Well, politics, I guess,
Hmm.
but like diet is it's like religion, right? It's like people take it immensely personal, and you're able to step back and be like, listen, the data's shitty, but what keeps being repeated and can we get some lessons from the noise of it? And I think your power in not being a physician, and a physician more than PhD, I would say, is like you're able to say, like, listen, the statins are in the top 20% of all prescribed medications in this country. There's a lot of vested interest in the status quo, and we know you're not swayed by any of that,
Yeah, I'm not. I
and
mean,
you're able to see it. Whereas
yeah, if
doctors are like, well, our job's to prescribe. What do you mean we shouldn't be doing this, right? And then you're able to actually like be like, because I'm not a doctor. I don't have those decisions.
yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, I have been forged. My passion has been forged in the fire of real serious disease, and my mom was on a statin drug when these symptoms first emerged, and if there was a pharmaceutical that I could have had filled for my mom, a prescription that I could have gotten filled for my mom that would have saved her from what it was that she developed, I'd be first in line to fill it, and I mean, I'm not averse to pharmaceuticals. I'm not anti them. I'm very much pro doing whatever it takes to be healthy today. But unfortunately, there is a lot of commercial interest and commerce with regards to these drugs and with these diets, and like the plant-based food industry is, I mean, it's worth billions of dollars at this point. And part of the reason for that is that plants are subsidized in this country. nutrient poor, energy dense plants tend to be subsidized, the most subsidized, and they form these products which have, incredibly high margins.
Yeah. Is that Michael Pollan's book?
Yeah, Michael Pollan's a journalist. He's written a lot on diet.
That was eye-opening.
Yeah. So I just try to help people kind of understand all these intricate connections, and not leading with fear, and kind of expressing the nuance and the, imploring people to become advocates for themselves.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much, I think.
Speaking as a urologist, all you really need to do is tell all the men that this is going to let them have erections longer. Because it's true.
Yeah.
You're missing that big hook opportunity on social media. As a urologist, there's my advice. It's good for your penis too. Let's talk about exercise, because I know you had mentioned it several times. Like, the data on exercise and Parkinson's is profound. And then, so exercise is prevention plan. And then number 2, exercise once you have the diagnosis. You got your mom into the gym, the role of exercise in slowing the progression of Parkinson's. When you're really losing that like inner motivation to do something because the disease kind of takes that away from people, of like, I feel like I want to get up and go, right? It kind of takes that away. So the role of like family and being like, Mom, we're going to go on a walk.
Yeah. Staying active is incredibly important, and exercise is incredibly important, particularly when compared to inactivity. I mean, inactivity is death. And so any mode of activity that you can embrace that's going to get your butt up and off the couch, I think that's fantastic, because, your body has fluids in it that don't necessarily have their own heart. And, but even your blood, I mean, we see that being sedentary literally drains blood from your brain. I mean, if anybody who's sat for an extended period on an airplane knows that, over time your legs start to swell up. It's like gravity does have an impact on
I get so stiff, like the joints. Yeah. It's crazy.
Same. So you got to move. You got to keep these fluids moving. Your lymph fluid, which is important for cancer prevention. I mean, exercise is one of the best things that you could do to reduce risk for cancer. But for the brain, I mean, it's keeping your blood sugar levels stable. It's fostering whole body insulin sensitivity. It's burning off some of those sugar calories that we know are typically make their way into, even your most ardent dieter's diet, typically, because it's just become so common, so ubiquitous in the food supply. And we're now starting to see that resistance training, building muscle, is really important from a longevity standpoint. I'm a big advocate of resistance training. I think the research has really come around to appreciating the benefits of resistance training, whereas in the past there was most of the emphasis, I would say, was placed on aerobic style training, cardiovascular training, which of course is important, but resistance training is crucial. And your muscles are a sink for glucose disposal. I think that's really important. Like, when you consume a higher carbohydrate diet, I mean, the glucose that you ingest by way of your diet, I mean, there's only so many places that your body can store that sugar, and your muscles are one of the main sites of glucose storage in the form of glycogen. So that's really important as well. And you're being stronger in body, it gives you the ability to stay mobile and to be able to continue to exercise throughout life. Yeah. So it is crucially important. And inactivity is a modifiable risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, physical inactivity. So you want to make sure that you're staying active. And then, God forbid you do one day receive a diagnosis for a condition like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. I mean, there is evidence suggesting that that exercise can slow the progression of these conditions. So whether it's by way of the increased expression of BDNF or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or just the increased blood flow that exercise, the impact that has on the brain, it's all really beneficial. So you have to find what you most enjoy and just stick to it. Yeah.
And I always tell people, I'm like, you don't wait till you want to do it. Like, you just do it. It's like, I wish I wanted to tie my shoes. We don't walk around with untied shoes. You just tie them.
Hmm.
and then you do them. Before we wrap up, I want to jump on hormones just to see where you are on them. My opinion, I've read the data on testosterone in men and the risks of dementia, the risks of frailty. I think the male testosterone data is a lot stronger. There's just more of it, probably a gender bias. I think Lisa Mosconi's 2023 meta-analysis looking at estrogen early for prevention. Again, hormones prevent, hormones don't treat. I think that paper people are being way too quiet about it. People are sitting around, they're like, we don't have anything FDA approved for prevention. And I'm like, we can't sit around and wait for the FDA to approve something. It's going to be years and billion-dollar studies. Where have you gotten with the role of hormones for, we'll just narrow it down to brain prevention of debilitating diseases?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pro HRT based on everything that I've learned from experts such as yourself and others like Dr. Gilbert Lenz, Dr. Mosconi, Jolene Brighton, Dr. Brighton. It seems like there has been great misconception about the purported risks of these treatments, and it seems like the benefits generally outweigh the risks. And we know that estrogen is protective from a brain health standpoint. And to me, it's a crime that this has been this ongoing, that there have been so many misconceptions based on really poor data, if I recall correctly, that has led women astray. And it only reminds me of the misconceptions surrounding animal source foods that still exist today, like eggs and like red meat and things like that. Like, it's a crime that we're demonizing these foods, and it's a crime. They're not totally related, but it's a crime also that we've been sort of misled for so long about the risks regarding HRT and the potential benefits. I mean, my mom was somebody who was always afraid of it. I just grew up hearing about it because my mom, we had these conversations growing up around the dinner table that, my mom was afraid of HRT because she thought that it was associated with increased cancer risk. And if it would have made her quality of life better, I mean, that's something that she should have been on. And if it would have helped prevent the dementia that she had developed, I mean, that would have been an amazing boon, that would have eased so much suffering that my family underwent. And so, yeah, I just think it's a real problem. But I'm just so grateful that we have advocates such as yourself who are speaking to women, debunking a lot of these misconceptions. It's so important.
I mean, my belief, I'm a big testosterone proponent for all bodies at this point. Like the effects on the brain, the female brain with testosterone is insane. They're like, it's only for libido. And I'm like, where's libido come from? The brain, right? This is a brain hormone. That's why we have a libido, is because the brain's functioning. And like memory, recollection, curiosity. Somebody's German, they learned as a child, is coming back since starting testosterone. Like the brain is waking up on testosterone. And to me, I'm like, there's not enough studies, and women don't want to wait around for studies. They want to feel like themselves.
Yeah. What do they say? If you're horny, you're healthy. That's a pretty good surrogate marker for health. I mean,
don't you? Maybe eggs and Pfizer need to team up and do some sort of like.
Maybe
eggs are good. They all need to get. It all comes back to the erections, man. That's how you get the people to pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, if you're horny, you're healthy. And actually, there's some interesting data on sildenafil, which is Viagra.
Yep, and dementia. Because it's a vasodilator.
There you go. So, I mean, yeah, I definitely think there's some truth to that. If you're having good erections, you're probably, and women have an analogous tissue as well. So I don't know how it's not as easily observed, I suppose, in women as it is in men. But it's definitely like if your erectile tissue is working as it should, that's probably a good thing from this, and a good sort of indicator of systemic health.
Yeah, we have that data, is old data in men showing longevity. The longer you're sexually active, the longer you live. And there's probably many factors on that. You live with somebody, they're probably helping you make food. Like there's probably a lot of things to that longevity data, but the correlation is that the sexually active people do have longer lifespans.
Love that.
I know.
It's great
I mean,
news.
it's kind of like no shit Sherlock, right? but we actually don't have data in females. So nobody's left.
Oh man.
But
Well, that
probably
wouldn't be the first time, right?
I know,
that females
right?
have been.
But probably these men were living with women, so we can correlate. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Check out his Genius Life podcast, which is sweet.
Yeah, what do you think of the documentary, Doc?
Dude, the documentary is so good. I watched it. It's my favorite thing. Two favorite things about the documentary is, number one, how you probably very on purpose showed your mom in the prime of her life. In the stark contrast of, you showed what was lost, right? Because I think, to be a doctor or to be somebody who just met this 60-year-old woman, you'd think, well, maybe she was kind of always like that. You don't know. And you showed her loving on you so much, and loving where she lives, and loving her community, and the stark contrast to be like, that's not who she is anymore. That part that's what this disease takes. This disease takes that part of you. And I thought that was so well done. And I thought that the music that you had in, which there was this, you put in a song and it said this thing, it was like, I'm going to chop it up now, but it was like, when you're old, you're remembering. When you're young, you're waiting to get started. And in the middle of your life, that's where you're living. And it just really spoke to me of like, okay, because I know I'm in the middle part right now, right?
That might have been was that during the credits?
Yeah, it was the end song.
That was the one and only Matt Nathanson's song, Pictures. Matt Nathanson is a multi-platinum artist who actually gave us that song to use for the film. And
it's so beautiful,
poignant, beautiful song.
So poignant. Yeah. It was like perfect for the documentary.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's what my takeaway was. Like, this disease, because people are, especially I think people our age, we're not always thinking about what does down the road look like. And to really put a person on this disease of like, it takes from you everything that you were. That's why you're so passionate about saying, you guys, do you know we can actually do stuff to decrease our risk of this?
Amen. Yeah. Well, anybody anywhere can watch the documentary at littleemptyboxes.com. littleemptyboxes.com. We're doing a fully independent release. We've had very little support other than from generous podcasters such as yourself to have me on to spread the good word. But it's an independent film, and just super grateful that it's now out there after 10 years of effort. And I think it's the most important thing I've ever done. And I would just love to invite all of your listeners, viewers, to go over and watch it, get to know my mom, get to see the real science of dementia prevention, and share the film with loved ones too. It's a powerful film to watch with family. So thanks so much for having me on to talk about it.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Kelly.